Well, thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Long overdue for us to have a chat.
It really, really is. Well, shall we get started since we're right on time?
Let's go.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the first of our 2023 Patreon interviews, and we are starting off in extremely grand style with Professor Carolyne Larrington of University of Oxford. Professor Larrington is one of the very top scholars in the field of Norse myth, especially studies of the Eddic poems, noted translator of the Poetic Edda. I believe your translation is now the second edition.
That's right, yeah.
And also, Professor Larrington takes what looks from the outside, for me, like a really strong, genuine interest in the way that pop culture and modern culture more generally manifests Norse myths. And this has come to the fore as recently as with your very newest book, The Norse Myths That Shape the Way We Think. Oh, you've got it right there. I think that will be available in the US in May. Is it already available in the UK?
Oh, it's been out in the UK for a couple of weeks now. I think it may be April in the US.
Oh, okay, April. All right. I have a digital proof, but no physical copies have reached this shore. So will you start off by telling us a little bit about your newest book and what the impetus behind it was and what we can find there?
Yeah, sure. So this book is, show you the cover again, The Norse Myths That Shape the Way We Think. And it's in a series issued by Thames and Hudson, following on from the Celtic myths that shape the way we think and the Greek and Roman myths that shape the way we think. And when I was asked to do this, it's a kind of follow-up to the 2017 book I did called just The Norse Myths for Thames and Hudson. I was a bit doubtful because the Celtic myths that shape the way we think kind of raised the question, well, do they, any of them, really shape the way we think? And so when I was, the Greek and Roman myths that shape the way we think, no problem. We all think about the Oedipus complex. We all know about Troy. We all talk about Venus and so on as being a kind of symbol of erotic love. And all of these things are quite well understood. And so at first I was a bit doubtful about whether Norse myths really did shape the way we think. And originally it was 10 myths that shape the way we think. And I thought, maybe I'll kind of whittle it down to 7. But once I got going, I thought, actually, there's a lot of ideas in Norse myth that really are permeating popular culture these days. And it's one of the things that journalists are always saying to me is Norse myths are really having a moment. Mm-hmm. Why is that? And I always say, in a rather sniffy way, Norse myths have been having a moment for 300 years, actually. And they go, well, yeah, but at the moment, they're really having a moment. And I think, that is kind of broadly true for the last, 10 to 15 years or so. And so when I came to think about the book, I thought I would organize it in terms of 10 myths. But here we're interpreting the word myth very loosely. So I thought I would start with the Norse universe. I would start with the world tree. And from there, I go on to the idea of Valhalla and Valkyries kind of bundled together. Then we have a chapter on Odin, a chapter on Thor, a chapter on Loki and his children. And so those are the main kind of mythological subjects, all of which I think are quite active in the contemporary world, plus the final chapter, which is on Ragnarok, as you might expect. And then chapters 6 down to 9 are, first of all, on the idea of the Vikings and berserkers. Then we have Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. Then we have Ragnar Lothbrok, who has been having a great 10 years, I would say, what with the Vikings History Channel show, and his sons have been popping up in The Last Kingdom as well. And he's all over quite a few video games. Then I thought I would look at the myth of Vinland and what that has meant. And then this final chapter on Ragnarok. So that's the kind of structure of the book. Starts off in each chapter by basically outlining the the myths as we have them in the ancient sources, and then looking at what happens to them once they're rediscovered, in a sense, in Europe, and then how they're being received in popular culture today. But I have to say that the popular culture I'm interested in is quite specific. I read novels, I go to the opera, I watch movies. I don't play video games. And I'm really not into black metal, and that is not going to change anytime soon, I don't think. So it's kind of selective, and it's very much kind of Anglophone thing. Obviously, I'm interested in Hollywood movies to some extent, but I really couldn't get into the reception of these things in Germany, let's say, or in other parts of Europe, because it's just too huge. But concentrating on what's happened in the UK and in North America, that's really the focus of the book.
I noticed you did talk a little bit about Wagner, but of course that's become pretty ecumenical. That's not just a German-speaking thing anymore.
No, absolutely not. No.
And actually, it's funny you mentioned, well, your pop culture tastes are a little bit restricted to certain domains, but they're still broader than mine. I don't encounter very many of these things. I don't watch Game of Thrones. I take it you might watch a Game of Thrones.
I have watched a lot of Game of Thrones a lot of times, yeah.
And that actually comes up quite a bit in this book. I had never even realized your book is the closest encounter I have had with Game of Thrones. So I had not realized that there were some motifs that strike pretty heavy chords that are kind of indebted to themes in Norse myth, like the three-eyed raven and this guy who apparently is kind of an Odinic figure that uses the raven to I don't know, get information somehow. Am I wrong?
Well, and that's one of the things which I think, and I can see people are kindly mentioning the chat that I've written a couple of books on Game of Thrones, and the reason I got into Game of Thrones in the first place was the last time I came to the US, which was in almost exactly this time of year in 2012. I hadn't seen Game of Thrones, but on the plane I started watching it, and the minute I started watching the first few episodes, I was just completely hooked because of its conception of northernness. It had wolves, it had ravens, it had these mythological symbols. The three-eyed raven as this kind of mystical figure doesn't come up till quite a lot later. But the idea of this figure which is kind of tapped into this mystical tree, and of which the roots spread out in this kind of rhizomatic form all the way across the north of the Seven Kingdoms, and you can get information through that, struck me as being so parallel to and kind of illuminating as well of what Odin is doing when he hangs himself on the world tree for 9 days and 9 nights to gain the knowledge of the runes. And the idea of the world tree is this kind of communicative network with the animals top and bottom and the squirrel Ratatoskr running up and down. That there's something really fascinating about something that I think George R.R. Martin, and following him, the showrunners, saw in that myth that they really brought to light in Game of Thrones. And the other thing, of course, is that the whole book series it's based on, the Song of Ice and Fire is what we get in Ragnarok. That the Fimbulvetter, the long winter followed by the kind of volcanic explosion that destroys the world. And yeah, Martin can see that, I think.
And I think reading your chapter in Yggdrasil made me think about all the ways that we start with often fairly thin mentions in the poetic and or prose edda, right? I mean, Yggdrasil isn't described in that much detail, right? I mean, we get a mention here and a mention there, but then, a few years ago, I remember I had found an injured bird, and I was looking up where can I take an injured wild bird, and there was a place called Yggdrasil, right? And
where else would you go? Yeah.
Yeah, well, but I looked at the about page on their website, and there's this long narrative about how, Yggdrasil binds everyone and is, the it's called the world tree in Norse myth. And I got thinking about all of this stuff that just has accreted to the myth that isn't
Mm.
really there in the original sources, including, as far as I can recall, the word world tree.
No,
And
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's a kind of general mythological category that's been projected onto it.
right, and I was thinking about just all the ways that this, it's not just that Norse myths shape the way we think, but of course it's the way we've shaped Norse myths shape the way we think. Right, there's almost a canon understanding of a canon that in fact itself is much more scanty. Or am I?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And it's the kind of difference between the genuinely medieval, if you like, and medievalism, and what you get with Martin, and I think with quite a lot of other pop cultural reworkers of Norse myth, is a response not to the original sources. They're not sitting there reading the Poetic Edda. They're not reading Snorri Sturluson. They've just kind of got an idea about these things, and they've read some general books about Viking stuff or Scandinavian mythological stuff, and that's enough for them to shape their vision, along with the kinds of things that they've seen in other rewritings, other reworkings. So quite a lot of it is sort of second order. It's not going back to the original text.
Mm-hmm. But I think part of what you strike at there is that some of these people, even working with second order sources, might have creative realizations that actually do come back and shed some light on what might be happening in the original medieval sources.
I think so. I think because I think George Martin, now I don't want to turn this into a kind of lecture on Game of Thrones, but Martin is a really astute writer. And he's also, history was his minor when he was at university a long time ago. And so he's got this real interest in how systems work. And so in the way that some fantasy writers don't bother necessarily to think through how, when you've got a huge continent, you're going to get messages from one end to the other. If you're in a medieval world that doesn't have telephones or the internet, then you invent a system sending messages by raven that will work. And the ravens don't instantaneously cross the world, but they get along quite quickly. And it's just that kind of thoughtfulness. What bird would you choose to use? Would you have a pigeon? I mean, you could have carrier pigeons, but he thinks, now I'll go for that mythological one.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a kind of rightness. It's making good choices in fantasy, I think, which is really important. And that's something Martin is pretty good at.
Do you think there are other writers or other programs that do a good job with that kind of reimagined source material in a similar way?
Yeah, I think Tolkien obviously does, and that's why he has such an enduring appeal. I think Ursula K. Le Guin does as well. I mean, she's not so enmeshed in Norse mythology, but she's certainly given a lot of thought to dragons and how they might function in her imagined world. Some of the writers I talk about in the book, particularly sort of young adult writers, think about a certain amount of stuff. Like Francesca Simon imagines a world in which Christianity never came to Britain, and so everybody's still worshipping Odin. And she thinks that through to kind of certain extent, but she doesn't completely imagine a whole world in which everybody's an Odinist. And I think in some ways Joanne Harris too goes a certain amount of distance in thinking about a really coherent world. But then she kind of moves from one book, which is in a kind of mythological space, back into a modern world where Loki has turned up and is kind of doing various things. And so the kind of world building isn't on the same level, I guess, as you get in something like Tolkien or in George R.R. Martin.
Heather asks in the chat what you might think of the works of Neil Gaiman.
Oh, well, I'm pretty keen on most Gaiman. American Gods, I think, is half of it is absolutely brilliant. The other half would be okay, but maybe in a different book. Because just when you think you kind of got to the kind of climax, you got the great battle between the gods, you got the kind of Ragnarok that is then short-circuited by Shadow, and we realize that Shadow is really Balder, and very, very clever stuff. And Neil Gaiman is such an astute thinker about mythology. I could have left it there, and then the whole business of the kind of detective story and the sacrifices and the guy who's really a kobold and so on, and the girls who disappear in the ice, and so, which is fine, but that could have been a whole other novel for me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I thought the first half was great, and I was just delighted when I was reading it. But then every now and again, when I got to halfway through, I think, okay, that's enough.
I can see it. Have you ever seen his book just called Norse Mythology? I think that is just the title of it.
I have, yes, yeah. Which is great. Yeah, as a retelling of the Norse myths, I think it's pretty good. When I picked it up, I was kind of worried that it was going to make a mess of things, but it didn't, and he chose one version of the myth of Freyr and Gerður, which is the kind of more sanitized version that you get in Snorri. And the one thing that did kind of puzzle me was that he spelt all the names correctly, except for some reason the name of the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr. And he spells it Jormungundur. And I think, why? Why would you do that when you spelled everything else absolutely correctly? But
that is weird.
It's what happened to his copy editing, I don't know. But also I kind of didn't quite like the way he retold the myth of Freyr and Gerður. And then at the end he spotted he identified, as everybody does, I think, the importance of the moment when the world begins again after Ragnarok, when the earth rises up out of the sea, and they find again the golden gaming pieces in the grass, the ones that got lost at the very beginning of Völuspá, the Ceres' prophecy. And Gaiman says that the gods get the gaming board, they set up the pieces, and they start playing the game again. But it's the same moves. So it's as if they're doomed to repeat themselves. It all begins over again. And I think as an idea for the cyclical nature of mythology, that takes out all the free will, all the choices the gods made the first time around that lead, if you like, kind of, if you want to read it in the way that Snorri tells us, as a kind of inexorable moving always towards Ragnarok, because they do this and they do that and they do the other thing, and that is where you're always going to end up, despite Odin's attempts to find an alternative narrative by asking loads of people about it. But I don't think when the world comes back again, it must be doomed just to repeat the same thing. The people are different. Odin has gone, Thor has gone, we've got a new generation. Why would they do the same things? So there I thought he was raising more questions than he was ever going to answer. And then it was the end of the book. So that was my feeling about that.
It's artful, but I think that's also part of what I'm talking about is this sort of super canon that's come over the original medieval canon. Now almost everyone talks about Ragnarok as a cyclical myth, which you can certainly interpret it that way from the Poetic and Prose Edda, but it doesn't ever say that, right? We don't hear that there was another Ragnarok before our world began.
No, I guess it's because of that kind of uncertain status that it has as having happened in some, if we're going to get a bit kind of multiverse-tastic here, in some universe it's happened because the Norse gods are no longer with us and they've gone, and we know what happens afterwards. But in another universe, it's still going to happen. We're still waiting for Ragnarok. We're waiting for this world to be destroyed. And then we'll see what happens after that, if any of us are around to see it. And A.S. Byatt, for example, in her book Ragnarok, decides that she's just not having any of that rebirth myth. And she says, the world will end. That'll be that. All that be left will be dark water like oil and that golden chess piece floating in it. And it's a pretty gloomy reading of the Norse myths there. But she's reading it in terms of ecological destruction, in a sense, and she sees no way out of it.
That's gloomier than even the original, which is that takes
Yeah.
work. Well, can I give you some questions that have come up in chat from listeners?
Absolutely, yeah.
Marie says, delving into the archaeological record, it seems there is plenty there on Freyr, but I don't come across him in today's pop culture, Marvel video games, etc., unlike Thor, Odin, Loki. I wonder why that is. Does he perhaps come across as boring in the context of Viking warrior imagery?
It's an interesting one. Yeah, I think he just doesn't have enough story. I think that's his problem, essentially. And the story that he has is, well, he may or may not have an incestuous relationship with Freya, but people don't particularly want to go there. You've got the version, the tale of his proxy wooing of Gerður, the giantess, but then he sends his messenger Skirnir to do the wooing, and then we don't see him and Gerður finally getting together because the poem ends there. And apart from that, maybe he rides around on his battle boar, Gutlimbursti, but that's about it. And so we've got a little family nexus for him. We know his father is Njörður. We don't know anything about his mother. We know that he has a sister. We know that he then gets assimilated as the ancestor of the line of Swedish kings. And so then he has a role to play as a kind of fertility god and an ancestor. But there's no story material for people to get hold of. So I think that's why Freyr he's not even as interesting as Freya in that respect. At least she goes around and does some stuff.
And actually, connected to that, Alexander was asking, Neil Price called Freya, quote, a being of power, one of the greatest of the deities, off quote, during the Viking Age. Why do you think she is less prominent in today's pop culture than some of the gods?
I think it's because the stories that we have about Freya are either they're quite restricted to the level of illusion. So we know that she rules over half the dead. Well, you kind of like to know how that works out. And she and Odin drink together in this sunken hall. And we have the story of her sleeping with the dwarves in order to get the great necklace Brísinga men. We have her being married to Other, who disappears, and then she weeps tears of gold. We have her going to see the giantess Hindla and asking her questions about ancestry in order to kind of promote her protege Otar to possibly to kingship. But none of them are super exciting stories again. And there's no kind of action in them. And I think that's the problem. I also suspect, as people have suggested, I kind of think Neil Price may have suggested this, but certainly somebody has recently, that there are probably a load more stories about Freya and Freyr in Swedish tradition, but Snorri over there in Iceland didn't know all that much about the Swedish tradition. He didn't go to Sweden. And so the stories that he captures are the West Norse ones that he knows from Iceland and from his visits to Norway. And he knows enough about the idea of Freyr as an ancestor, but Freyr's great adventure doing this or doing that, unless it's in the remaining poetry as it is in Skirnismál, then he hasn't got anything to go on. And so I think that's the problem for the Vanir, that they're just not known about because of that probably stronger Swedish connection.
Sure. In fact, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, for example, I don't think any poem in the Poetic Edda has Freyr as an actor except Forskirtnes. I mean, in Lokasenna, he's there as a speaker, but not
Yeah.
as but doesn't do anything. Freya, of course, occurs in a few more places, but like you said, there's not that much action to them. But then it also occurs to me that a lot of the action that we show Thor and Odin and Loki doing in pop culture isn't that related to the action they do in the original sources. You know, I don't know if there's a Marvel version of Thor going to Gerður's home or something.
I don't know. I mean, Freya doesn't even appear in the movies, does he? He's, as far as I can remember, or Freya, come to that.
I don't know.
You've
I
got
haven't seen those either.
Heimdallr. Oh, you haven't? Okay. Well, we're interested. You know, Frigg wanders around as Thor's mother, kind of wringing her hands a bit and going, "Oh, he's a bit out of control." Particularly in the first one, which is more of a sort of family drama. It's directed by Kenneth Branagh, so it was like a sort of Shakespearean tragedy. But otherwise, Freyr and Freya are out of the picture because it's all about this Odin, his son Thor, the adopted brother Loki, and Heimdallr, who's standing around guarding the Bifrost all the time. And then Sif, as Thor's wife, has been repurposed as just a warrior woman, so that he can have his love interest with a human being. So the Aesir, the gods, are being pretty pared down in the Marvel universe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, come to think, I did see the very first one, although that was in the context of watching it with rip tracks. But yeah, you're right. It's interesting the way Freyr and Freya are kind of just shunted to the side there. The Vanir gods. Well, it's probably just also, as you mentioned, a result of Snorri and our other Icelandic scribes not being as familiar with these gods that are probably more popular in the East Norse world. Payson asks, do you think we're talking about the Ragnarok myth a little bit earlier, if the bit about survivors in Gimle is added later in medieval times? And of course, it's always hard to tell when things come from, but do you think there's anything to that?
No, I don't think so necessarily. I think what we have is probably an ancient tradition of Gimle as being the hall that replaces Valhalla, if you like. It's the new home of the gods afterwards. But I think Snorri then decides that he's going to make it into a kind of version of heaven. It's the place where the elect are going to go. And he's also developing an idea of something that looks like hell from material that comes earlier in Völuspá, and probably does have Christian origin. So I think maybe what Snorri does with Gimle is later. But I think the name itself and the concept of where you're going to be, what options there are when the world returns again, is probably quite an ancient one.
Does the name occur outside of Völuspá and Snorri? I can't think of a place where it does.
Not sure if it's not somewhere in the kennings.
Oh, okay.
Somewhere in Skaldic poetry, but can't think of anything off the top of my head.
And by the way, you are a contributor on the Skaldic Poetry Project, aren't you?
Yeah, a long time ago, I got a Christian poem to do. I did Sólarljóð, but I haven't done anything since then.
That's a pretty interesting one.
It is interesting, and I did it. I was happy to do it because it's in Eddic meter, and it has mythological material kind of buried in it. But I'm not a Skaldic person, so I've kept well away from any of the rest of the really difficult stuff.
Yeah, well, there are Skaldic people, and thank goodness for them. Aaron asks, is it clear which realms are destroyed during Ragnarok, if not all, and is Yggdrasil destroyed?
Well, I don't think Yggdrasil is destroyed. So which realms are destroyed? No, it's not at all clear. I think the assumption is that the realms that Snorri kind of systematizes and the ideas of the different realms that we have from the Eddic material, they're all within the cosmos that is either what's risen up out of the sea at the beginning of Völuspá, or what's been hammered together out of bits of Ymir, if you want to follow that creation myth, or what's been licked into shape by Othumla the cow, or has it risen out of Gylfaginning, you know, all those different kinds of origins to the world. But I think the realms are all within that space, and they're all destroyed at Ragnarök. But I'm not sure about Yggdrasil, because I think, in a sense, if the Völuspá, I mean, this is an argument from absence, isn't it? That if the Völuspá poet had wanted to show Yggdrasil going down with an almighty crash, he or she would have done so. But there's also the question of where the humans, Leif and Leifrazir, are hiding, the ones who creep out of something that's described as Hodmimir's wood in Vafthrûthnismál. Where is this wood? Is it Yggdrasil itself? And in a sense, my feeling is that we don't want to multiply too many trees of various sorts somehow surviving Ragnarök. So if anything's going to survive it, I think it's Yggdrasil. But I couldn't prove that. But my sense is it's still there. It suffers, it groans, it's endangered, it's really under threat when Ragnarök comes along. But I don't think it necessarily is destroyed.
And the word used in Vafthrûthnismál, isn't it Hodmimis Vidur? It is Vidur,
yeah.
Right? So that could be an individual tree, I suppose.
It could be. I'm kind of generalizing woodiness here, if you like, because some people would say that it's something that's made of wood, or it's a wood, like a forest. I think I think it's that fundamental connection between human beings and trees that we have from the very beginning, that humans on Asker and Embla were trees. The mythic imagination still sees that resemblance when we look at the kennings, where warriors described as trees of weapons, apple trees of swords, where women are described as trees of linen, or the ring-bearing trees. That equivalence that people are trees is a real fundamental conceptual metaphor in Old Norse, I think. And so to me, it makes sense that the trees and the people are together at the end as well. And it's from the trees that they spring back again.
And I really like the economy of, well, we don't have to assume another forest or another tree is surviving, of course.
Yeah, it's Occam's razor, really, isn't it? We don't multiply the number of trees that somehow miraculously survive Ragnarök. And it's something Francesca Simon does at the end of The Monstrous Child, is to, when Ragnarök is over and everything and everyone has gone, and she's escaped from it because hell has been sitting it out, if you like, in the world of the dead. And she realizes that she's now liberated from where the Aesir threw her all those eons ago. And she's able to come back out into the world of sunlight and start creating humanity again. And she does it with carving chips of wood, shaping wooden figures once again. And Francesca, I think, can really see the way that cycle of how humans and trees are interlinked with each other, how that plays out all the way across the mythology.
Sure. And it occurs to me too, while we're talking about this, just how many names Yggdrasil has, and the question of what so many of them mean. I mean, Yggdrasil itself is, does that mean the steed of the Terrifier, meaning Odin? And then why is that its name? And then why is it sometimes Yggdrasil's Askur? I think in Fjolsvinnsmál it's Mima Meidor.
Yeah.
Right. So there's all these different names for it. So and of course, you look at so many other mythological figures that have multiple names. It's no surprise.
Well, anything that's so connected with Odin too is going to have multiple names, I think, because he's the multiplier effect when it comes to names.
Yeah. And I'm noticing that there's that meme element in two of those names, Mima Mather and Hod Mimis Vither, right? And there we see the shadow of Mimir.
Yeah, situated underneath the tree, if we're correct, that the head is in that well that's or lake or body of water at any rate, that's actually under the tree itself. And so there's a very close connection between him and the tree in some way.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the most fascinating shadows on the edges of Norse myth is Mimir and who he is, where he comes from, because you get two different stories about that just in Snorri. What is his role? Where is his well? What exactly did Odin get from giving him his eye? All this is, I think, one of the biggest real mysteries out there.
It's fascinating, and it's one of the things Joanne Harris decides that in her retelling of the history of the gods in the two books, the Gospel of Loki and the Testament of Loki. It turns out that Mimir is the one who has been orchestrating everything all along, and that even Odin has been kind of a sort of puppet in a way. That Odin is playing out the role that he has to play in a sense. But Mimir, who is referred to as the Oracle, is of course the one who's giving Odin quite a lot of advice. Odin pops over to see him and asks him what to do about this, about death of Balder and so on. And Loki is the one who finally realizes that it's Mimir in league with the witch Heather, the one who is burnt 3 times in Völuspá and keeps recurring, and then kind of disappears, Heather or Gullveig, as she's also called. And the two of them are the kind of evil geniuses that want to bring about the chaos of Ragnarok. And Loki is up for it by that time, because he's tired of it, of the way in which the gods have been treating him. Essentially, there's this kind of feedback loop of him doing stuff, the gods getting annoyed with him being punished, his kids being chained up or cast into exile, and him getting more annoyed with them. You can really see how conflict escalates in some of the treatments of the story of Loki in the young adult novels.
That sounds unique. I mean, a little bit like American Gods, although without the Loki-Odin axis or the alliance between them.
Well, of course, with Joanne Harris's books, of course, Loki is narrating them in the first person, so he's quite keen to get himself off the hook, as it were, sure, and to justify himself. And he has a kind of fairly annoying persona, I have to say. I mean, I think if I encountered Loki, I'd be first to try and chain him up as well, but and shut him up if possible. But at the same time, the ways in which he, if you look at mythological history from his point of view, you can see that he's not without having some provocation.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't yet read Melvin Burgess's new novel Loki, which is just came out a few months ago. But yet again, somebody else wants to take Loki's point of view and offer a different way of, a kind of revisionist way of looking at the story, in which the Aesir are no longer the heroes.
I guess that kind of starts in the 70s, was it, with Grendel?
Yeah, I think I think it's already started in Wagner, in a way, okay, that sure. you can see that from the moment that Wotan decides that he wants this massive hall, Valhall, built, but he's a bit cagey about paying the price that he negotiated, and has to double cross Alberich in order to get the Rheingold to pay off the master builders. Already lack of good faith has come into the world of the gods, and Odin is the one who's ripped a branch, Wotan I should say, has ripped a branch off the world tree, carved the runes, the oaths that bind gods and men on it, made it into the shaft of his spear Gungnir. This is supposed to guarantee the importance of oaths and laws, and he just breaks them. because he wants to, as soon as the first opera. So it's not surprising that by the time we get to Götterdämmerung, Wotan, Valhall, the world tree itself, all the gods, all the heroes, all the Einherjar who've been hanging around in Valhall, all go up in flames, and all you're left with is once again humanity going, "Whoo, I guess we're going to start over."
Right. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that already having some. Well, it already has some resonance in the medieval sources. I mean, Helga Kvíða Hundingsvana too. Doesn't Dagr say it was Odin who causes all ill? Otlu Bolvi, I want to say.
Yeah. Well, it's in Odin's interests, I guess, because I think, to be fair to Odin, he's one of the few gods who's actually interested in people. Because one of the questions I was asked at a talk I was doing recently was why the Norse gods in the myths that we have are just not bothered about humans at all. And what would humans get out of worshipping them, since they don't seem to give anything back? And now I think what we have in the myths is very different from what was actually lived practice in somewhere like Iceland. But Odin at least does kind of pop up with his proteges. He's interested in kingship and whether somebody's being a good king or a bad king. And then there's that moment towards the end when he pops up in the story of Sigmundr, for example, and says, "Okay, time's up. We need you in Valhall. Your era is over now, and your sword breaks, no tongue breaks, and or whatever it's called in Volsunga Saga, and the hero's always going to lose eventually because he has to go to Valhall. He has to get ready for Ragnarok."
Right. We're not the protagonists in Odin's story, but we at least are of some interest in him, if only as sort of crops to harvest.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Well, there's a great bit in Hákonarmál where King Hákon is so annoyed by the fact that the Valkyries have come and summoned him to Valhall, and you've got Odin going, "Way, strew the benches, everyone get ready, it's great. We've got this hero is coming, Hákon is coming." And then Hákon is, "Why did you make me lose the battle?" to the Valkyrie, right. And the Valkyrie is going, "Well, you're sorry you had to die, but you guys fought pretty well." Right. And then as he comes into Valhall, they're saying, "Yeah, put down your weapons, sit down, have a drink," and he's going, no, I'm not stepping away from my weapons. I don't trust Odin, and it's bad policy to move away from your weapons in a strange hall. And then the poet Eyvindr then goes on to talk about how it's necessary to kind of harvest the heroes because the grey wolf is looking at the dwellings of men, and nobody will ever be born like him again. But I'm always quite impressed by imagining what it's like to be that hero dragged off before your time to Valhall and going, "Yeah, hey, I still had stuff to do here."
Right. And it's not that reassuring when the Valkyrie just says, "Well, your side did win."
Yeah, it's just not with you. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and all of this about a Christian king, at least nominally Christian.
Well, brought up in England, and yeah.
I mean, of course, who can see into the hearts of people in the 950s? But it's or nine. I guess he died in 961, right? So hard to know what exactly is going on. Yeah. But that is such a fascinating testament, that poem, short as it is, and of course that's also the one where we also see Deur Fjä Dea Frændur outside of Hákonarmál, right?
Yeah.
That is a fascinating poem. I don't know if I've covered that on my YouTube channel. That's in your Poetic Edda translation, right? You include some of the other
No, Hákonarmál. No. Okay. I talk about it in the Norse myths, but it's in the Skaldic project in the King Sagas volume.
Right. I remember that your translation, you included, especially in the second edition, quite a bit more material that's not in the Codex Regius, right? Don't you have Hervarakvíða or the Battle of the Goths and the Huns?
I didn't do the Battle of the Goths and Huns, but I brought in the Hoaxbook version of Völuspá. as a separate text, and
That's
the
neat.
Waking of Angantyr, as it's called,
Okay.
Hevarkvidr, if you like, and the Fjolsvinnsmal material.
Okay, right. Stuff that there's just not very much attention given to in Anglophone scholarship, I find.
Well, people are increasingly interested in the Waking of Angantyr, I think, but very little has been done on Fjolsvinnsmal at all. And I really wanted to include the Battle of the Goths and Huns, but it just took up so much space to explain what was going on. You'd have to have big chunks of prose in between. And I suggested it to my editor at OUP, who said, no, too much prose. You can expand the edition, but not to that far.
Sure. Yeah, Joseph Harris is one of the few scholars I can think of who's really done a lot of work on Fjolsvinnsmal.
Yeah. And there's still not a great edition of Fjolsvinnsmal, but Peter Robinson from Saskatchewan wrote his doctoral thesis on it 40-odd years ago, 35 years ago, and he's planning to actually get that in publishable form. And I'm supposed to be working with him on it next year at some point.
And the Old Norse text is in Bjesteden Olesen and Jonas Christensen's Edukvæði.
Yeah.
With the modern aesthetic apparatus, like the other poems in that.
Yeah.
I'll dive into the chat again here. Tom asks, thinking about a Viking Age or medieval canon, to what extent might characterizations have been known to both poets and audiences alike? For instance, why is Thrymskvida so effective as an inversion of the character of Thor? So the in common understanding of these characters among the audience and poets.
Yeah, who knows? It's difficult to find any evidence for what people might have known in times before the conversion, or what kind of ideas they might have had about people. I mean, I guess the couple of bits of evidence that we have from both of them, I think, from Sturlunga saga, from the contemporary history that was being written down in the 13th century, is a point where a woman who is enraged with one of the chieftains, and I can't remember the names of anyone involved, tries to stab him with a dagger and tries to put his eye out and says, I want to make you like Odin, because that's who you are like anyway. So this idea of, even 200 years after the conversion, the idea of Odin as somebody whose word cannot be trusted and is one-eyed is still present, is still live in culture at that point. And then there's somebody is called Dala Freyr, aren't they? I think there's somebody who's a bit of a ladies' man, and that must be one of those stories about Freyr that we've lost. That Freyr was somebody who apart from his relationship with Gerður, whatever that was a bit of a seducer of women, perhaps. So there's those little bits of evidence, but I think we got enough in the poems, exactly as that questioner suggests, to characterize Thor as being somebody who is super masculine, super engaged in hyper masculine pursuits of fighting, drinking if necessary, and to be made to dress up as a woman and to go off into giant lands, into Jotunheimr, to marry Thrymer. I think the comedy does exactly depend on the inversion of something that's really well known.
And by the way, the figure who gets almost stabbed in the eye, isn't that Snorri's dad? Isn't that Sturla? I
think it is, actually, yeah.
Which I've always thought was kind of interesting. It shows there's, if the story is true, there's a lot of interest, a lot of people still talking about these gods around Snorri in his youth, including in some high emotion instances like that.
Yeah, I can imagine your father saying, and then she said, just as they were grabbing her before she poked my eye out, and then she said, you're like Odin, and him thinking, yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I have a memory clear as day of every time my dad's eye almost got stabbed out. I'm sure Snorri would too. Caleb says he has a strange question. I don't think it's that strange. What is your take on Heimdallr's name? It's tough.
I'm not sure I have a take on Heimdallr's name. And Dattler seems to be possibly a word that means tree. And Heim is home, or it's world, or it's something between. So maybe he is a kind of, the fact that we're told that he has this muddy back where the loam maybe from the tree, the shining mud, the earth that courses down the trunk of Yggdrasil seems perhaps somehow to accrete to him. It may be that there is some kind of connection, real profound connection between Heimdallr and the tree that we just can't quite put together. His hearing, perhaps, or the Gjallarhorn itself is at the root of the tree. And so maybe he also has this, what I like to think of as a kind of cybernetic system, if you like, that the tree is a kind of comm center at the heart of the universe. And Heimdallr's hearing, Odin's eye, are there monitoring what's going on. And kind of like, as I can see, somebody like the three-eyed raven is getting information in there, so they know what's coming. But yeah, I think there is something in that name that links him to the tree.
It almost seems like a name that makes more sense for the tree, when most of the tree's names don't make that much sense for the tree.
Yeah.
That's yeah. There's interesting questions there, difficult to answer. Brian asks, do you think any interpretation, whether show, movie, or book, has represented the locations, the geographical relationship of the 9 realms in Yggdrasil accurately?
No, probably not. But I don't think accuracy is something we can really hope for, in a sense, because the edit material just doesn't give us enough consistent information as to what the 9 realms are, even if there are 9 realms. We got the 3 realms in Grimnismal, 1 under each tree, and then we've got the kind of horizontal surface, and then we got the giants are over here, but the frost giants are down here, and none of this really makes very much sense. And Snorri tries to systematize it. So I think it's a kind of lost cause to try to build a universe in which you have all of those worlds in some kind of coherent and logical relationship. I also think, to be honest, that 9 worlds is a bit too many worlds to depict in a story that's going to make any sense. That if you've got the world of the gods, the world of humans, the world of the giants, maybe some kind of underworld, maybe some kind of realm of fire where you're going to have Surtur and the fire giants. That's enough worlds. And it reminds me of when I first started reading N.K. Jemison's 100,000 Kingdoms. I thought, that's an awful lot of kingdoms. Yeah, how are we going to make 100,000 kingdoms work? And in fact, what you get in that series is like 3 kingdoms plus the 997 others, which don't figure at all. But just, yeah, they're out there somewhere. So again, I think it's the kind of, let's not multiply these entities if we can't make any use of them. Let's stick to the simple facts. So yeah, I mean, I think the 9 worlds is a bit of a red herring. People are always trying to figure out what they are and where the Svart Alvar are and the Ljósalvar, and do they have separate worlds and so on. And I think it's just Snorri going, here's a nice mystical number that's well attested across Old Norse, the number 9. Okay, let's say there are 9 worlds and we'll figure out what they are later on.
Sure. There was an article by, I want to say, Eldar Haide that made an impression on me. I think it was in Mole of Minna, about all the different ways that people and gods travel from world to world, and how they don't paint a coherent picture of where they are in relation to one another. It's and that made an impression on me about the fact there isn't a map. There's a sense of you go to places that are somehow, other, right? Underground, underwater, through fire, up the rainbow, but the relation, you can't make a map of exactly where these things are placed relative to one another.
No, absolutely not. I think the one thing I think we can probably hang on to is the sense that the world of the dead is down. When Hermodr is sent down to fetch Balder, there's a definite sense of going from up to down. But I'm not sure when he comes back that he's going from down to up, as it were. So, but I think, the rest of the time, we feel as if when the gods and the giants are interacting, it's on the same plane. And if we're told that the world of the frost giants is actually under the roots of Yggdrasil, that should be a down as well. But it's not how the stories are imagining it.
Right. And it may just be the convenience of the given storyteller, or I wonder with the numbers, like 9 realms. I think sometimes about this. I think there's an Irish account of a Viking raid or something where someone writes, if 10,000 tongues and 10,000 mouths screamed for 10,000 years about this, they could never tell about all the depredations of the Vikings. I think, well, this is just supposed to impress you with how many, right? I mean, are we talking about 10,000 different mouths, or does each mouth have 10,000 tongues? Yeah. Right. It's just foregrounding a big number and then giving.
It's kind of like the 50 years that Beowulf reigns. That if we take that 50 years seriously, then Beowulf is toddling off to fight the dragon age 70, and you're thinking now, Beowulf, no, this is. I mean, it wasn't a great idea to go against the dragon single-handedly, but even more so perhaps when you're 70. So we just have to take a number like that, 50 years, as something the Beowulf poet uses for a long time, but not that long a time. Sure.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And by the way, we've taken about an hour of your time. You are free to go when you want to, but there are many questions if you have the time for them.
Yeah, I've got time to go on for a bit longer, sure.
Okay. Peter asks, if one goal of academics is to dispel the popular myths about the Vikings, does all the creative licenses taken by writers and directors, etc., when dealing with the source material, make life difficult for you?
I think it would if I were a historian, because then I would feel duty bound to spend a lot of time saying Vikings did not do this. Viking is not an ethnic, well, I do say it's not an ethnographic description. It's a job description as much as anything, as Neil Price says. People go Viking. They spend some time Viking and then they stop Viking, or else they're dead, obviously. But then you retire from Viking, you go off and do some farming or some trading or something like that. So I think we've got over the whole horned helmet business now. Mercifully, in schools in the UK, the first thing you do if you go and talk to some kids is to say, did the Vikings wear horned helmets? And they all go, no. And you go, yeah, that's a great start at least. So I think as a literary scholar, I'm able to say we have what the historians can tell us, we have what the archaeologists can tell us, and the archaeologists can give us a lot of evidence. We have to be really careful about interpreting and just sticking labels on figures and saying this is Freya, this is Odin, this is a Valkyrie, this Gotlandic picture stone depicts this, unless you've got a real kind of identifying thumbprint, like here's a horse with 8 legs. Okay, we do know what that is. Here's a horse with 4 legs. That could just be a horse. It doesn't have to be a mythic horse. So I kind of think that whatever people want to write about the world of the Norse myths, if it brings people into becoming interested in it, then that's fine in some ways. And it's kind of the gateway drug argument, if you like, that you let people get really excited about American Gods or the Thor movies, and then maybe you can entice them in to start reading the Poetic Edda. Yeah, I'm not sure that necessarily works, but yeah, so many students that I teach have come to medieval studies through Tolkien, and then after that through Game of Thrones, that there is something to be said for not just to say these things, we put up with them because they bring in new people who are become interested in medieval studies, because they are genuinely interesting in their own right, I think. Even some of the things that I look at in the book, which I don't like particularly, and the second Thor movie would be one of them, which is one of the modern retail or the modern treatments of Norse myth that I think, right, I never need to see that again. Which is not necessarily true of the first Thor movie or the third Thor movie, which I did enjoy in all kinds of ways. So yeah, there are good retellings, thoughtful retellings, and ones which haven't given enough thought to a kind of logic or even the kind of post-medieval history of a motif, that they just stick it in and go, right, this is what we're going to do with this.
And this brings to mind a question that I get asked so much that I get tired of, and you may also be tired of, so ignore it if you want.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, how did you come to this field of study? Because you do have this obviously rich interest in the pop culture and stuff that I don't have. Did you come in through that, or did you develop your interest in things like Tolkien and Game of Thrones and such later? And again, ignore this if you're tired of answering this question.
Well, I mean, no, I guess what happened was when I was about 7, I read, because it was just about that time that children's authors in the UK started retelling the Norse myths again after a kind of period after the war, after the Second World War, where nobody wanted to go anywhere near them. There was a taint of Nazism around them. By the time we got to the early 60s, people were beginning to retell the stories, and I read a book called The Heroes of Asgard that was published in 1964, and when I was about 7 or 8. So I was interested in that. I read Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, when I was about 9 or 10, and thought, yeah, that's quite interesting. But I didn't think it was the greatest thing ever. But it was kind of there in my mind. But then I went to work in Norway for 4 months when I was 18, and I met my first Icelanders. And I thought, wow, I really like Scandinavia. These Icelanders are really interesting. They were telling me about the land they came from, which had no trees and no trains. And I thought, wow, that sounds really strange, because I'd never given Iceland a moment's thought. And then when I started studying English, and I realized that I had to study Old English, but that Old English was connected to Old Norse. And I went to a lecture by Heather O'Donoghue, who talked about the connections between Old English and Old Norse. And I thought, I could study this. I could study all that stuff I loved when I was 7. And that's what I'm going to do. And so it was exactly that moment when I was 19, when I thought, right, that's something that the undergraduate course that specialized in medieval literature in Oxford permits, and I'm going to do it. So that was how I came to it.
I see. Well, we have very different stories that way, and I appreciate hearing yours. And again, I know it seems like something people always want to ask, so I didn't want to. I wanted to give you an escape valve from the question, but I do appreciate your answer to it.
Now I'm always happy to talk about it, because it's just a series of kind of crazy coincidences in a way. The woman I went to work in Norway with in the summer of 78 went on to medical school, became a general practitioner of medicine, never went anywhere near Norway again. It made no difference to her life whatsoever, and it completely changed my life. And I always think, yeah, what would have happened if I hadn't gone to Norway?
Sure. Oh, it's no, our lives are full of those weird forking moments. I mean, I can think of a few without getting dragged down that. Uh, Alfia asks, I'm going to try to get a couple questions from people who haven't asked one before. Was there a clear attitude towards adopted people in Norse myths? Is Loki the only adoptee represented?
I don't think we can know that. Um, is he even adopted? I think it's quite hard to say what he's doing in the community of the Aesir. And as far as the Marvel universe is concerned, yeah, he's Thor's adopted brother. But I don't think we have him placed in any kind of either um, adoptive or any other kind of family relationship with the other Aesir, except insofar as he's married to Sigyn and he has some kind of normal children as well as all the weird ones. So, and he's never referred to as a foster of any sort, is he fostri? So the idea of foster children in medieval Icelandic society as kind of adopted children is very powerful, I think. But I don't think we can take that across into the mythology.
Yeah, I think that the characterization of him as an adoptee has become really current lately through the Marvel universe because he's portrayed that way there. I can remember in teaching Norse mythology that students would so often give me papers where their understanding of the character of Thor and Loki was enriched by the knowledge that they were brothers, which is never that's like they would come up with really interesting takes on stories. But well, you're importing this notion that they're brothers from Marvel. It's never mentioned anywhere. Are you sure? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what we could, and I can see somebody in the chat saying he and Loki and Odin have sworn blood brotherhood to one another back in the day under circumstances that we just don't know anything about. And Frigg says in Lokasena, we're not going to talk about what you two did in the old days. We're not going to talk about that. And you would so like to know what that was, what that deal was between them that sealed the idea that Odin cannot have it. If Loki is there, Odin cannot drink without him. He's always got to have a seat at the feast. There's something really intense that binds the two of them together. And that's something that some of the later writers take up, because of course it's a real question. Loki is such a nuisance in some ways. If you can throw his kids out, if you can send hell down to hell, you can chain up Fenrir, you can put the Midgard serpent out in the ocean. Why can't you get rid of Loki? Why can't you just, eventually, of course, he gets chained up and taken out of the game temporarily. But why do they tolerate him for so long? I mean, he's useful. He gets them out of various scrapes, but quite often it's scrapes he got them into. And I think there's some kind of doubling between him and Odin. They both know Seidr. They've got this blood brotherhood going on. They've got they go out together on adventures sometimes. So particularly in at the beginning of the story of the Rheingold there, why do people take Loki along on these things? I guess he's kind of insurance policy, so that if everything goes wrong, you can go, hey, Loki, how do we get out of this? Well, I'll do something quite sneaky and clever, and then we get out of it.
Well, I guess it's like when you go through a bad experience and you say, well, at least I have a story to tell. You bring Loki so that you'll have a story to tell afterwards, right?
Yeah, he makes things happen.
He's kind of a catalyst.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, and this is something that I think people trying to read myths logically often ask is why is Loki even here? Right? Like just kick him out in the beginning. And one of my joking answers has always been, well, he and Odin swore they wouldn't drink without one another, and Odin wants to drink, right?
Yep.
That's all he lives on, supposedly. So
yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. And the finest wine as well, supposedly. Yeah. I mean, obviously there was the mead of poetry, which kind of tops up his levels there.
But I mean, that to me, it seems like a reasonable explanation. Do you want to answer do you have an answer to big question that I'd be interested to hear you talk about, but it may be too big, especially for this late in the game. How do you go about starting to translate Norse poetry, says Tom? Is that too huge for right now?
Um, well, I don't know that there is an obvious answer really. You kind of open up the text, you look at it, you look up the words you don't know, you look at the words that nobody quite knows what they mean, and read the various arguments for this word meaning this, that, or the other, and then try to put it together. But I think one of the things when I was doing the second edition of the Poetic Edda was feeling that I kind of knew what it meant, and I had now reworking the poems, I have more liberty to think about, can I reproduce some of the rhythm? Can I make sure there's more as much alliteration as I can manage in here without making it sound really peculiar? And I also, by that time, had the benefit of the Edda Kommentar published by the team in Frankfurt. So I could actually look up all the possibilities around different meanings for contested words and go, you know what, I'm going to go with that one. And I'm going to go with that because it makes sense for the reading that I have, the understanding I have of this poem. But one of the things that was also important when I was doing that version was not to read too much of other people's translations in English, because I thought they would creep into my voice, or the voice I could hear in my head of
Right.
what the poem sounded like. And so I read quite a few German translations, and that was helpful because it suggested to me the Germanic words. It suggested to me basically English words, or words which had originated in Old English, and not so many Latinate words or words that derive from French. And at some level, I wanted to make it sound a bit more Germanic, a bit more akin to Old English than, I mean, it didn't mean that I couldn't use words like magnificent if I wanted to.
Sure.
But in places where there was a choice, I might go for a different, shorter, less Latinate word. So those are the kinds of things that I was thinking about when I was translating.
There are two things that stand out to me there. One is I also, when I'm translating, don't read English translations of the same thing. But I don't read as much German, but I read Norwegian and Swedish and Danish translations while I was working on things like that. I don't think I was ever consciously looking for Germanic vocabulary as such, though. That's an interesting point. Another is alliteration.
I don't think I was consciously doing it, but I found Germanic vocabulary came into my mind more than the Latinate ones did, simply because those are the texts, the versions I looked at more recently.
Sure. That's I hadn't never thought about that. Another was alliteration, right? You mentioned trying to alliterate as much as you could. I do find that English speakers can often find alliteration kind of funny, which is not the not the intended effect. So it's something that I've tended to, in fact, avoid unless I'm being super sparing, right? I will, whether in translating or in writing something original, I'll sometimes turn away from alliterating pairs because, like, I feel like English audiences kind of snicker at it a little bit. Do you feel like there's a similar reluctance to alliteration? And
I think I think as long as you don't have too much of it, and actually it is something my old tutor said to me many years ago. He said, do you think that there's more similarity between the words hat and cat, or do you think between cat and I forget what the other word, something like cat and cap? And I said, for me, cat and cap are more similar than cat and hat. And he said, is that because he said, my theory is that's because you come from the north, that if you come from the north of England, you have temperamentally, and this has to do with being rooted in ancient speech patterns from Old Norse and Old English, that you have an ear that's more attuned to, and a aesthetic response that's more attuned to alliteration than to rhyme, that rhyme is something the Southerners like. And because he came from Lancashire, I obviously wanted to impress him by Northern solidarity. But I felt that cat and cap were more similar. And so I think there's maybe different tolerances for alliteration. And as long as you make sure it's just one, two stresses in your line that alliterate, I think that's fine. And if you're not obviously stretching for a weird archaic word to make the alliteration work, instead of something which you can imagine saying in normal speech. And it's something I've written about in a couple of places, is trying to find words which will work without getting a bunch of maidens coming into your text, or talking about gore, or brand for swords, and all those kinds of things that early translators of the Edda were always, if they were trying to get alliterative effect. So you even get it in Auden and Taylor. They start having swains and all kinds of things. Lee Hollander renders himself almost incomprehensible with all those archaisms.
Yeah, and that's not even the oldest translation people turn to today. Bellows is decades older, but Hollander sounds centuries older.
Yes, he does, doesn't he? Yeah.
That actually
mind you, trying to make sense of William Morris is just a real struggle. Yeah.
That was actually a game that we would play in grad school. We called it like William Morris or fanfic, and you had to guess if someone was reading a real passage from William Morris, or was it a made up passage by William Morris? And it's really hard to guess because you can imitate that style fairly easily.
Yeah, if you can get those endlessly long lines. Yeah.
Some of the most archaic. I mean, he's more archaic than Chaucer in places, deliberately.
Because he messes around with syntax, something chronic. Yeah,
but people really like that style. I was going to mention toward wrapping up, this was a segue for me. You had mentioned earlier about forking moments in your life, and actually one of those for me was a kind word from you, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago on Twitter, the only place we've ever really talked. I remember I was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, and had only just kind of recently begun all of my outreach stuff with the public, with the translations of the YouTube channel and stuff. And I don't even remember what the exact context was, but you were so kind to me then, and have been so kind to me throughout the years, when you could have, chosen to be aloof from this weirdo, random, American, adjunct guy. And I've really appreciated that. I mentioned to someone that we were doing this interview this weekend, and they jokingly said, "Oh, you're deadly rival." And I said, "Yeah." Like anything but. I feel. So thank you.
But why would I not want to encourage and support anybody who takes Old Norse seriously and thinks about it and studies it and has the same kind of interest in telling people what it's about and popularizing academic study in the way that you do? I think this kind of outreach is absolutely vital to counteract some of the more pernicious myths that Norse in particular can generate in contemporary culture. And kind of one of the figures who turns up in my book is, of course, I get the chance to have a photo of the QAnon shaman Jake
Oh,
and
right.
Jelly, and just to talk about what it means to have those tattoos on his chest, how the Yggdrasil tattoo, the world tree tattoo, the Valknut, the interlocking triangles, and the Thor's hammer as well, what that seems to be saying about the ways in which Old Norse myths of masculinity function. It's something that's really important for people who understand the material and who can communicate and who want to communicate to people. It's our responsibility to come out and talk about this kind of thing.
And I think you and I are engaged in much the same project in some ways. I found your earlier book, the one called The Norse Myths, a really good summary that I've recommended to many people. It's just a good starting place to, here are the stories that, as they actually exist, presented in a very readable way, and you can follow from that book into, all the nooks and crannies that you want to. And you've
it
been
came
very
out the same week as Neil Gaiman, which was kind of annoying, but then
well.
sometimes they got reviewed together and people said, Gaiman is Gaiman, but if you want to know what the Norse
Yeah.
myths are actually about, then this is the one. So it kind of paid off in the end.
For what it's worth, the one I've recommended is yours. But then
Glad
I've
to
never
hear.
seen the Gaiman one.
You never have? Okay.
I have a weird relationship with the pop culture around this stuff. I kind of resist looking at it. I didn't always. So I mean, I read American Gods, but that was 20 years ago. As I got into I guess into grad school, I started really resisting looking at any of this. And I don't know, it's just held as a habit now. In fact, I don't even have I don't think I have a copy of any of my own books, like I just
Yeah.
but I don't know. It's just because this is work, I guess, and I keep what I need for work, and I don't seek it out outside of work hours, right? It's part of why I never watched something like Game of Thrones or really got into the Thor movies or anything like that. Or
well, it's a pleasure to come, maybe, who knows?
Yeah,
and
maybe.
when I've talked to people about Game of Thrones, people who kindly come along to hear me talk about it, and they say, it sounds really interesting. Yeah, I've never watched it, but I think I will now. And I go, yeah, 70 hours. And they go, if I have a kind of rule of thumb, if they're under 40, they go, yeah, I can do that in a weekend. And if they're over 40, they go, you know what, life is too short. And that's the end of that.
I must be over 40 in spirit. but you've made me more interested in it. And my brother says that as long as pop culture is more than 10 years old, I can see it. So I guess it is now within the realm of things I can see.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. If you're looking at historical pop culture, that might help.
Yeah. That'll help me. Well, it really is a privilege to get this chance to talk to you. This is the first time I think we've talked live.
I think that's right. Yeah.
We've never met.
No.
Which is a
You were
huge
in
shame.
Norway last summer, weren't you? And I was in Norway a few, I guess 6 or so weeks later.
Well, I'm hoping to do another Iceland visit this summer, and perhaps I can swing through the UK. There's a few, I guess, things I could do. So we'll see. I'll let you know if that happens.
Yeah, let me know your diary. I'm hoping to be in Iceland for at least a week in August myself, so we might run into each other there.
Yeah, let me know when that is, because that would be a really neat thing to try to coordinate. I would love to see you in Iceland. Well, let's talk more about that afterwards. And again, thank you so much for taking time.
If we get the funding for that. But it's been great to talk to you, and great questions from the people in the chat as well. There's some really interesting ones. I'm always not wrong-footed, but I always, when I do something like this, what people ask in the chat, there's always somebody who asks a question that makes you think, wow, I really need some time to think about that. But you have to talk on the hoof. But it's kind of makes me scratch my chin.
Well, my Patreon community is great about that, and my assistant Stella is great about keeping this community going. So thanks to all of them, that also all of y'all who are here, all 40 or so people, and Professor Carolyne Larrington. Thank you so much again, and for now, all the best to you.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity, and do look out for the book when it comes out in the States, and let's try and do this again sometime soon, or meet up in Iceland, Jackson.
I'm looking forward to it. I want to make it happen.
Okay, take care, everybody. Right, bye.